She had once been a hero, a soldier who risked everything for her country. But now, she was nothing more than a forgotten face on the streets. The freezing wind howled through the empty alleys of Columbus, Ohio, biting through layers of worn-out clothing. Pedestrians hurried past, their eyes fixed ahead, pretending not to see the woman curled up in the shadows of an abandoned building. Her name was Elena Carter, and once upon a time, she had worn a uniform with pride. Tonight, though, she was just another vagrant, another problem for the city to push aside. Then, the beam of a flashlight sliced through the darkness. "Ma'am, you can't be here." A voice, firm, authoritative. Heavy boots approached, crunching over broken glass. Elena barely looked up. She knew the drill, the warnings, the orders to move along. But tonight, she was too tired to care. The voice grew sharper. "You're trespassing." Before she could fully react, rough hands grabbed her arms. The next thing she knew, she was face down on the pavement, the cold biting into her cheek as handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. Elena Carter, former U.S. Army sergeant, had just been arrested like a common criminal. What happened next, inside that cold, fluorescent-lit courtroom, would leave an entire city speechless. Before we continue, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and comment below. Do you believe veterans are treated fairly after their service? Let's talk about it. Now, let's get back to Elena's story, because this is where everything changes. The night was silent except for the wind rattling through the empty streets. Elena Carter didn't flinch when the officers towered over her, their shadows stretching long against the cracked pavement. She had been in worse situations. In war zones. She had faced gunfire, explosions, chaos. But there was something about this moment, about being dragged from a crumbling doorway like a stray dog, that made her chest tighten. "On your feet!" one officer barked. She moved slowly, her joints stiff from the cold, her old injury, a torn ligament from her second tour, flaring up with a sharp sting. The younger cop, rigid and tense, kept his hand near his holster. The other, older and heavier, let out a tired sigh, as if he had seen this 100 times before. "You carrying any weapons?" he asked. Elena shook her head. "Just trying to sleep." The older cop hesitated. For a split second, she thought maybe he would let her go. Maybe he saw something in her that reminded him of someone. A sister, a mother, a friend. But then the younger one grabbed her arm, harder than necessary. "Let's go." Her muscles tensed. Instinct, training, the years of discipline ingrained in her body. It wasn't resistance, just a reflex. But to the young officer, it was all the excuse he needed. In an instant, she was shoved forward, her balance lost. The ground rushed up to meet her, her knees scraping against the rough pavement. A sharp weight pressed into her back, a knee, forcing her down. "You're under arrest for trespassing." The words stung, but not as much as the truth behind them. She had once worn a uniform, saluted the flag, fought for a country that now saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience. Cold steel locked around her wrists. The older officer let out another sigh. Maybe regret, maybe just exhaustion. It didn't matter, because in that moment, Elena Carter stopped being a soldier. She became just another case number. The police cruiser rumbled through the streets of Columbus, neon signs and streetlights flashing past the window in a blur of color. Elena sat in the back, wrists aching from the tight handcuffs, the cold metal biting into her skin. She kept her gaze forward, unblinking, refusing to let herself feel humiliated. She had been through worse. She had survived worse. At the station, the process was mechanical, soulless. Hands, an officer took her fingerprints, pressing her fingers roughly onto the ink pad. Click. A camera flashed, capturing her face. Expressionless, hollow-eyed, like every other forgotten soul who had passed through these doors. "Take off your shoes." A female officer handed her a pair of worn slippers and an orange jumpsuit. Change. Elena held the jumpsuit in her hands for a moment, feeling the rough fabric between her fingers. She had once worn military fatigues with pride. The uniform had meant something. It had given her a purpose, an identity. But now, this was just a label, a sign to the world that she had lost. She changed in silence. The holding cell smelled of sweat, old metal, and disinfectant. The cot was stiff, the blanket thin. She lay down, staring at the cracked ceiling, counting the stains on the concrete. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. Hunger was nothing new. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. Memories clawed their way in. The sound of helicopter blades cutting through the desert air, the weight of a rifle against her shoulder, the echo of distant gunfire. Then, the moment that changed everything. The explosion, the searing pain in her leg, the faces of her squad mates, blurred by shock and dust, the months of physical therapy, the medical discharge, the promises that someone would take care of her. Lies. The VA clinic had a 6-month waiting list. The disability checks barely covered food. Every job application was met with polite rejection. Employers asked about her employment gap, nodding with forced sympathy before moving on. Then came the eviction. Her landlord hadn't cared that she was a veteran. The rent was overdue. That was all that mattered. The shelters were always full, so she had found a place where no one would bother her. 4 walls, a roof, nothing more. And now? Now she was here. In the morning, a public defender, a man who looked like he had been awake for 3 days straight, flipped through a thin folder with her name on it. "You're being charged with trespassing," he said flatly. "It's a misdemeanor, but if you have priors—" "I don't," she interrupted. He nodded, jotting something down. The DA might offer a deal. Time served. Maybe some community service. He looked at her, eyes tired. "You have anywhere to go if they let you out." She didn't answer, because the truth was, she didn't. The lawyer sighed, scribbled something else, then closed the folder. "You'll be in front of the judge tomorrow. Just be respectful, and we'll see what happens." Elena didn't bother hoping. She knew how the system worked. People like her, people without homes, without power, rarely walked out of courtrooms with dignity. That night, she lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling again. Would they let her go? And if they did, where would she go? The metal cuffs were cold against her wrists as the guard led her into the courtroom. The chain around her waist rattled slightly with every step. Elena kept her back straight, her chin up. If she was going to be treated like a criminal, she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of looking broken. The courtroom was smaller than she expected. A few people sat in the gallery, some waiting for their own hearings, some just passing the time. Near the back, a journalist with a notepad was already scribbling. Then there was the judge, Judge Thomas Whitaker, white-haired, glasses perched on the tip of his nose. He looked like a man who had seen thousands of cases just like hers. Just another file, just another problem to deal with before lunch. The clerk's voice rang out. "Elena Carter, charged with criminal trespassing. How do you plead?" Her lawyer nudged her. "Not guilty, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. The prosecutor stood, a woman in a sharp gray suit, flipping through, her notes as if she had already decided Elena's fate. "Your Honor, the defendant was found trespassing in a condemned property. Officers removed her after multiple complaints from local residents. We ask for standard sentencing, time served and mandatory probation." Elena barely reacted. She had expected worse. Then the judge finally looked up. "Miss Carter," he said, adjusting his glasses, "do you have anything to say for yourself?" She hesitated. What could she say that would matter? That would make a difference? "I'm not a criminal, Your Honor," she said finally. "I just needed somewhere to sleep." A murmur rippled through the room. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. "The law is clear. he said. "That property was not yours." "I know," she admitted, "but I didn't have a choice." The prosecutor scoffed. "Everyone has a choice, Miss Carter." Elena let out a dry, humorless, chuckle. "Do they?" For the first time, the judge really looked at her. Not as a case, not as a file, but as a person. He flipped through the papers in front of him, his expression shifting slightly. Then he turned to the prosecutor. "You read this report?" The prosecutor nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then read it out loud." She hesitated. "Read it," the judge ordered. The prosecutor cleared her throat. Elena Carter, former U.S. Army sergeant, served 2 tours in Afghanistan, honorable discharge, multiple commendations, including the Bronze Star. The journalist scribbled faster. A few people in the gallery sat up straighter. The judge turned, back to Elena. "Is this true?" "Yes, Your Honor." A silence settled over the room. The prosecutor shifted, suddenly uncomfortable. The judge exhaled slowly, flipping through the file again. "Well," he muttered, "that changes things." And no one was prepared for what he was about to say next. If this moment shocked you, hit that like button. And tell me in the comments, should veterans be treated like this? Should someone who served their country end up in handcuffs just for trying to survive? Let's hear what you think. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The air in the courtroom had shifted. The judge's fingers tapped against the bench, his expression unreadable. Elena stood still, her wrists still shackled, her pulse pounding in her ears. Then Judge Whitaker leaned forward. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice measured. "Do you know who I am?" Elena frowned, confused. "No, Your Honor." The judge nodded, as if he expected that answer. He removed his glasses, his gaze steady. "I didn't expect you to, but I remember you." The prosecutor's head snapped up. The journalist in the back stopped writing. The room held its breath. The judge turned to the courtroom. 15 years ago, my son served in Afghanistan. He was barely out of high school. He told me stories about a Sergeant Carter, a woman who trained new soldiers, who pushed them to be better. A woman who saved his life when his convoy was hit by an IED. Elena blinked. Her mind reeled, trying to sort through the endless faces she had trained, the countless soldiers she had fought beside. The judge's voice softened. "He told me she was the toughest person he had ever met, that she didn't just teach them how to fight, but how to survive. I didn't realize until now that he was talking about you." A weight settled in her chest, something heavy and impossible to define. The judge inhaled deeply. "Do you know where my son is now?" Elena shook her head. "He didn't make it home." The silence was suffocating. The judge rubbed his temple, his voice quieter now. "But before he died, he told me something that stuck with me. He said the hardest part of serving wasn't the war, it was coming home. He said soldiers don't always get a hero's welcome, that sometimes they come back and find there's no place for them anymore." Elena felt her throat tighten. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The judge turned to the prosecutor. "Let me ask you something," he said, his voice sharp. "If my son had survived and ended up in Miss Carter's position, would we be here? Would we be treating him like this?" The prosecutor hesitated. "Your Honor, the law." "Forget the law for a second," the judge cut in. "Would we be here?" The question hung in the air, pressing down on the room like a storm cloud. The prosecutor didn't answer. The judge let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Then, without hesitation, he picked up the papers in front of him, Elena's case file, and tore them in half. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the bailiff looked stunned. "Miss Carter," the judge said, tossing the torn pages aside. "This case is dismissed. Effective immediately. You are free to go." Elena's breath caught. For a second, she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. The prosecutor opened her mouth, as if to protest, but the judge didn't give her the chance. And furthermore, he continued, I'm making some calls. I know people in the Ohio Veterans Affairs Office and the Franklin County Housing Program. By the end of today, you'll have a safe place to stay and a caseworker to help get you back on your feet. Elena's hands gripped the wooden defense table. Her legs felt unsteady, as if they might give out beneath her. Is that real? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The judge's expression softened. It's the least we can do. A lump formed in her throat. For years, she had carried the weight of survival alone. For the first time in a long time, someone was fighting for her. The judge nodded at the bailiff. Uncover her. The cold steel slid off her wrists. She rubbed them absent-mindedly, still in disbelief. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned back to the prosecutor. I expect your office to start looking at these cases differently, he said, his tone firm. You don't get to just check a box and move on. People's lives are at stake. The prosecutor, now visibly flustered, gave a stiff nod. Elena took a deep breath. She had walked into this courtroom believing she had no future. Now, for the first time in years, she had hope. The cold air hit Elena as she stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of the last 24 hours still pressing against her chest. The world outside felt unreal, too bright, too loud, too fast. She paused on the steps, blinking against the afternoon sun, feeling like she had just woken from a dream. She was free, but freedom was complicated. A small crowd had gathered. Reporters, sensing a story, pressed forward. Miss Carter, one called out, a microphone in hand. How does it feel to have your case dismissed? Elena looked at her, then past her, at the people moving through the city. People who hadn't noticed her yesterday but now stared as if she had suddenly become someone worth seeing. She exhaled, her breath visible in the winter air. I don't know yet, she admitted. A car pulled up to the curb, and a woman in business casual stepped out, holding a clipboard. Her expression was calm but focused, like someone who had seen too many cases like Elena's. Miss Carter, the woman said, her voice steady. I'm from the Franklin County Veterans Housing Program. We have a place for you. For a second, Elena didn't move. A place for you. The words felt foreign. She had spent so long being invisible, surviving on the outskirts, that the idea of someone offering her real help felt unnatural. But then, she thought about what the judge had said. This country failed you. Maybe. But today, someone had chosen to do the right thing. She nodded and stepped toward the car. As the door closed behind her, she glanced out the window. Across the street, on a bench near the courthouse steps, a man sat huddled against the cold, arms wrapped around himself, head bowed. His clothes were tattered, his boots worn down to the soles. She knew that posture. She had lived it. She wasn't the only one. Elena Carter was getting a second chance. But how many others were still waiting for theirs? The car pulled away from the curb, but she knew this wasn't the end of her fight. Elena Carter's story is not unique. Thousands of veterans, men and women who once swore to protect this country, come home to find themselves abandoned, struggling to survive on the very streets they fought to defend. How do we let this happen? A soldier gives everything, their body, their mind, their future. But when they return, the system too often turns its back. They are left to fend for themselves, ignored, forgotten, sometimes even punished for their struggles. Elena was lucky. One judge saw her, truly saw her, and chose to act. But no one should have to rely on luck to survive. So, what are we doing about it? It's time to take action. Support veteran housing programs. Donate to organizations helping homeless vets. If you see a veteran struggling, don't just look away. A conversation, a meal, even an opportunity can change a life. Elena got a second chance. Now, let's make sure no one else has to wait for theirs. If this story moved you, Share this video. Let's be the voices for those who can't be heard. And to everyone watching, thank you. Let's make a difference together.